This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. With the nation in the midst of an economic downturn that hasn't been seen for generations, public schools are bracing for the impact on their students, staff, and bottom lines. Joining us to talk about it is one of the few reporters on the K-12 finance beat. He's Daarel Burnette of Education Week. Daarel, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk about this. We're at an incredible moment and a troubling moment on the precipice of recession, or what could even potentially be a full-blown depression. Can you give us an understanding of what you see as the likely impact of that on school budgets?
Almost every school district in the country is likely to be impacted by this. The vast majority of states spend a large portion of their budgets on public schools. On average, 25%. In some states, it's up to 50% of their budgets go to public schools. And because so many states are experiencing budget cuts in the realm of anywhere from 5% to 25%, there are some states that are expecting 30% budget cuts. That's more than likely going to impact schools.
And we know, of course, that in some states with the biggest school systems, a school system could be the largest single consumer of tax dollars, but also one of the largest employers.
Exactly. I mean, schools employ more than 7 million people. In some communities, they are the largest employer, if not the only employer in some communities of small towns. So I have heard from some economists who have been saying that laying off so many public employees could actually lengthen the amount of time that we are in a recession.
Daarel, can you give us the quick primer version of how schools are funded, just so we're all on the same page here? I know it varies widely by community, but I also think some people have a misconception about how much of that share comes from the federal government.
Yes, school districts get about 10% of their money from the federal government. Another 40% comes from the state. Another 40% comes from local property tax revenue. That's just very generally speaking, but it varies by districts and it varies by state.
So what are going to be the big influencers here on the money that's flowing to schools? What are people most worried about?
This recession is caused by the widespread shutdown of the economy. And this is, restaurants aren't open, people aren't buying lottery tickets, there's a high unemployment rate. And so income and sales tax has really plummeted. And then you also have, for states that get a lot of their revenue from oil, you also have like a decrease in oil price. So state revenue is what's going to be most impacted. Property tax revenue, which is sort of the other half of school revenue, is not going to be as drastically impacted because properties are reassessed every once in a while. And as we saw at the last recession, school districts can raise or lower their property tax value depending on how much flexibility they have from both the state and local taxpayers.
Who are the districts that are least likely to be hurt by this downturn, that may be able to at least hold out and weather the storm?
So wealthy districts that are heavily dependent on local property values that likely have a low millage rate right now, and they can raise that millage rate. They haven't necessarily reached the state's cap. They will fare well. And this is what we saw at the last recession. Property tax revenue actually went up during the last recession because so many districts just went to their voters, or they did not go to their voters. They just did it on their own. They just raised the millage rate to make up for lost state revenue.
What are you hearing right now from district leaders and K-12 policymakers? Do they think we're right on the brink of this?
No. And this is what's so disturbing about the moment that we're in.
Whoa. Daarel, did you just say no?
Yes, we've done surveys on this, and I've talked to a bunch of experts about this. A lot of district administrators think that there will be either a federal bailout or that their state lawmakers will protect schools, and that state officials are actually inflating the type of deficit that they are talking about. There's another phenomenon that's going on in a handful of states in which state lawmakers actually have not released their projections, their fiscal forecasts, and that is both political and there's a variety of reasons why they're doing that. But in states in which we have seen governors or state legislatures tell districts to get ready to cut, we are seeing anywhere from states telling districts to cut 20% of their budgets. I mean, this is sort of unprecedented.
Would you say this response is unprecedented? I mean, typically when there's a moment where district leaders can say, we're going to be in trouble and we need more money, they take advantage of that opportunity.
Yes, but I think that what's happening in the K-12 system right now is just really unusual in the sense that we've never had anything like this happen in the past, in which we have to put so many kids into distant learning programs, in which you have to think about how to reopen schools in the fall, in which you have to do social distancing, et cetera. So I think budget problems or a budget crisis is just so low on the hierarchy of worries for district administrators right now.
Well, that's interesting. So they're playing their cards kind of close to the vest right now and dealing with the more immediate issue, which is how do you keep kids learning in the middle of a pandemic? But what are the experts telling you about what might be happening in the fall when it comes to K-12 finance?
What I think people should be ready for is almost every state's legislature will reconvene this month or early next month, and they will say to their districts, okay, we need to make some deep cuts to your budget. And not next year's budget, but this year's budget. And that means that districts will have to reopen their budgets and they will have to reopen negotiations with their teachers and they will have to likely institute mass layoffs. Depending on the timing of the legislative session, this could run into the beginning of the school year. And I think because there are so few administrators, there's so few policymakers, and there's so few education reporters who were around during the last recession, which was mild compared to the recession that we are in now. I think that mid-year budget cuts is something that very few people have actually seen. It's actually a very sort of traumatizing experience for everybody involved.
Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about assessing that risk and that likelihood. For reporters or even people who are just curious, Education Week is a new database and it lets you go in and search out a district and figure out what are the chances of seeing those budget cuts. Tell us a little bit about how you put this together.
So a while back, I had kept hearing from experts that state spending on several school districts is very, very high and surprisingly high. And I was actually in Montgomery, Alabama, writing about the military base there and their relationship with the school district. And the week that I was there, the local CFO kept saying, look, we're getting 85% of our money from the state. So if the legislature decides to meet late, or if they decide that they want to make a 1% cut to their budget or a 1% addition, we are at the whims of the state. So that really got me questioning how many districts across the state get more than 50% of their revenue. I think traditionally we think about school funding vis-a-vis property tax because historically this is where school spending is most inequitable. But in the last 30, 40 years, states have infused districts with a lot of money. And in addition, you have this phenomenon in which local voters have voted down districts' requests to raise their property tax value. So when I started looking at these numbers, I was just shocked as to how many districts get more than 50% of their revenue from states. We calculated about 6,000 districts, but I know in some states, such as Florida, such as Kansas, the vast majority of districts get almost all of their money from the state, which means that they are going to experience some really, I hate to keep using this word, but it's hard to understate this, unprecedented budget cuts this fall.
So when you look at the database, there are four categories. There's severe, which is at the highest risk of facing these cuts. Then you have high, then you have moderate, and then you have low. And the low rated districts are the ones that Education Week is calling the most likely to withstand this recession if that's what happens. What were the cutoff thresholds for those categories?
So we did it in 25% categories. So 100% to 76%, 50% to 75%, 25% to 49%, 0 to 24%.
I appreciate you having four categories so there isn't just this big bulk that ends up in the middle. How deliberate was that?
We kind of kept going back and forth about this. I think my thinking was, if you think of like a family household and, you have two parents and one of them loses their source of income, that's going to cause all kinds of trauma in the family. So I started thinking a little bit like of school districts like a family household. And if you lose one source of income, you're going to have to make some very serious decisions in the near future. The other thing I would say too is that I've talked to a lot of districts who are in that low category, 0 to 25% category. And I actually use an example of one of them in my story. These districts typically have big savings. And because they are such high spenders, the things that they are thinking about getting rid of are things like the golf club or maybe, the after school chess program, or, they might have to get rid of a counselor or two. But they are not talking about the sorts of layoffs that people in the 75 and above percent category are, which is, 100, 200, 300 teachers in a matter of a year.
If I'm an education reporter and I've gone to the database, I've looked up the districts that I cover. I mean, that's going to be the first thing that I do. The next thing I'm going to do after that is I'm probably going to look up the district where I went to school. What do I do after that? How do I use this database to inform my reporting?
I really encourage education reporters to focus their fiscal lens on the political body that is distributing the money to your district. So if I'm in a district in which 75% of my money comes from local taxpayers, that means the school board has a lot of flexibility as to how they spend their money. So you should hold the school board accountable for the sorts of decisions that they make. If I'm in a district in which 75% or above my money comes from the state, I need to look at the state capitol and start asking the governor and the legislatures why they are making the decisions that they are making.
We're talking with Education Week's Daarel Burnette about the looming likelihood of K-12 budget cuts in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Daarel, how prepared are districts right now for this economic downturn? I'm wondering what lessons they learned and better practices they put in place after the last recession.
I think what makes this downturn so unusual, and traditionally districts, because historically they have been so reliant on property tax revenue, which is a very stable source of revenue, the vast majority of districts historically have been shielded from economic winds. The last recession was the first time in which districts really kind of had to respond quickly because sales and income tax were collapsing at such a rapid rate. But I will say the last recession, it was much, much slower than this recession, and there was a big federal stimulus package. Now, our reading currently is that there will not be a federal stimulus package, and the CARES Act, which was $13.5 billion, it's just a drop in the bucket for the type of deficit that school districts are going to face in the near future. A lot of the policies that we saw play out during the last recession that were very, very harmful for districts that serve a significant number of low income students, I think we're going to see a lot of those debates pop back up, such as last in, first out, or things such as the role that teacher pensions play. Teacher pension costs are going to skyrocket next year. And how are states going to deal with the pensions? Are they going to pay them down now, or are they going to decide not to make payments at all? There's a lot of talk right now about social emotional learning and the fact that a lot of these kids are going to need a lot more wraparound services. But typically, how layoffs work, those are typically the first programs to go. Pre-K is something that's very vulnerable in this recession. So I do think that there will have to be some tough questions that administrators and state leaders are going to have to ask. I think one of the things that I raised in my story, which is historically, states have made across the board spending cuts to schools. And this disproportionately impacts districts that serve a large portion of Black, Latino, and poor kids. And so you have a situation in which districts that were already academically and financially struggling are going to get hit even more in a recession because they are so heavily reliant on state aid. And across the board cut is not a fair, efficient, or equitable way to cut spending. And I think oftentimes reporters just kind of take this as, okay, it makes sense that everybody is going to get a 10% cut and everybody's going to have to cut 10% from their budget. That's not the way this works. If I am a district that gets 70% of my aid from the state, a 10% cut is going to be huge compared to a district that gets 15% of the budget comes from the state. So I just think that it's really vital for us to sort of question the sorts of strategies that are coming out of state houses as to how to cut school spending.
A lot of what you talk about here, you raise in the city that you focused on as part of your case study, and that was Rochester, New York.
Rochester is in this kind of messy situation that just got worse this year when they overspent their money. I called it gross fiscal mismanagement in the story, but that's kind of understating it. But Rochester has, for a long period of time, just been underfunded by the state. Their city council, which effectively controls their budget, has refused to raise property tax dollars. And so over the years, they just became more and more and more reliant on the state. And because New York in the past has underfunded schools. I mean, their funding formula was created a year before the last Great Recession. And so they've just been behind in their payments for a long period of time. This has just really fallen hard in Rochester. And Rochester is kind of considered one of the poorest cities in the country. So while their situation is a little bit unusual in the sense that, they had this overspending, they had to make mid-year cuts this year because of the overspending, and something like the coronavirus that hit New York in such a hard manner. I mean, they had the highest caseloads in the country. They had to shut down New York City, which is a huge source of revenue for that state. That is going to fall on the shoulders of Rochester. And I think there's just no way of sort of getting around this question of, which districts are going to be hurt by this recession, which kids are going to be hurt by this recession, and laying off a tenth of their teaching force. That has academic repercussions. And I know during the last recession, we kept saying, well, money doesn't matter. But when you see the type of cuts that these districts have made in the past and are going to make in the future, this specifically goes right at the heart of what schools are meant to do, which is to teach.
If I'm writing about school finance, and, frankly, for some people, it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of math, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of context. How do I do that without losing my audience?
I think the best strategy is establish a relationship with your district CFO. It is their responsibility to describe their fiscal situation and describe it to you in a way that makes sense. I mean, one of the interview tactics that I always use, I just keep repeating things back to folks. So what you're saying is this. So if I understand this correctly, this is what is actually happening. And I also think that one of the things that is really sort of unfortunate about the media landscape in general, but especially for education reporters, is that oftentimes district folks will tell us, well, the school funding formula is too complicated. And it's true, school funding formulas can be complicated. And because education reporters, the vast majority of education reporters do not cover state houses, they're not engaged in the sorts of debates around school funding formulas. But it is important for us to know very basic things, such as how much your money comes from the state, how much your money comes from the local government, how much of the money comes from the federal government, and how are you deciding to hire and lay off? How are you making these decisions? And so I really encourage reporters to keep their stories simple about one funding strategy. So, for example, this story was about state versus local spending, about who gets laid off first, and very short and tight. Just make it very specific and very simple.
I think that's good advice. I mean, if you're feeling overwhelmed, then probably your reader is feeling overwhelmed as well, whoever your audience might be. One story I'd like to see reporters do that I think is something that we all universally understand, which is the idea of a rainy day fund. Find out in your district's operating budget whether the school board has set a requirement for a percentage of the operating budget to be reserved in a rainy day fund. What's in it now? What was in it in 2009? When did they spend it? And what have those dollars been going to?
Oh, yeah, that's a great, great story. Only because that was ideally one of the lessons from the last recession is that you got to save. Don't spend all of the federal stimulus dollars right away. Don't hold off layoffs by spending the money. It's better to have cash on hand for unexpected costs. And it's true that states and local governments decided to save. Their savings accounts are really eye-popping, but school districts did not. And that has a lot to do with the fact that it was just very politically, it was a tough pill to swallow for teachers who were not getting pay raises. When they weren't getting pay raises and they were sitting in these school board meetings and they were talking about, having millions and millions of dollars in their savings account. I mean, one of the most infamous cases is LA, which I think had something like, 100 million, 200 million. They had hundreds of millions of dollars in their savings account, and they had yet to give the teachers a raise for years. But yes, a lot of some school districts have saved, but the vast majority have not. So that's just an easy sort of good story to go after because a lot of this has to do with financial responsibility.
What's another story you'd love to see local reporters tackle?
One of the things that's actually easy to do is just looking back at the last recession to see how your district fared. All of this is documented by the federal government and by state governments, and it should definitely be documented by your school district. What was the average teacher pay then? What is the average teacher pay now? Did the average teacher pay go up during the last recession? Did it stagnate or did it go down? Who got laid off and how did they get laid off? You can look at which schools had the biggest cuts. You can ask folks who were around during that time, school board members, teachers, et cetera, what it was like going through the last recession. I think that is good to prepare journalists for the kinds of questions that they need to be asking during the next recession. I try to better understand financial concepts by writing about them. So, profiles of your CFO, or trying to okay, how does the state's most recent budget, how does it impact my district? And that kind of helps me better grasp a lot of the crisis that districts are going to be going through in the near future.
I think that's a great story idea. And if I can throw out just one more, it would be to look at the people who are making the decisions and signing off on these budgets, and those are the school board members. So what kind of training have they received? What kind of expertise do they have in this? And a lot of district school board members are essentially volunteers. They may be compensated very little for a lot of time, and they're now being asked to preside over a massive crisis, a financial crisis that requires a level of expertise and experience that some of them just may not have. So who are the experts they're bringing in, and what are those experts getting paid?
Yeah, I mean, when I covered Memphis schools, I just kept going to the budget committee meetings. That's a committee that matters the most because the school board's most important job is to pass the budget. And a big open secret in school finance is that most budgets just roll over from year to year. They don't make big changes, despite the many, many flaws that are in school spending. School spending is one of the most inequitable, disturbing corners of K-12 policy. The more you better understand it, the better you are able to explain exactly why this is unfair, why this is inequitable, why this is inefficient. I think being in the room when these discussions are happening will help the reporter the most.
Daarel Burnette is a staff writer for Education Week, covering education, funding, and finance. Daarel, thank you again for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.